Well, welcome everyone to Intersection, where theology and practice meet. My name is Carson Reed, and along with my co-host Randy Harris, we want to say thank you for joining us today. Intersection is designed to draw wisdom and insight from special guests on timely and important substantive topics for church leaders and Christ followers today. Today's session, which is episode 7 for us, is entitled Ministerial Self-Care in a Time of Pandemic. This topic, as we will explore with our special guest, is addressing the growing recognition that ministers and caregivers and other folk who are involved in attending to people are really struggling right now in the increased realities of pressure that's coming with the pandemic, along with the ongoing pressurized work that many ministers work with in their vocation. As we gather in this virtual space, let me just a couple of logistics here. We want you to let us know where you're tuning in from. So get into the chat feature and say hello to everyone and let us know where you're at. It's always a pleasure to see folks from corner to corner of the country tuning into this. And a little later, as Randy and I engage with our guest, we'll have some time for questions and answers, Q&A. And so utilize the Q&A feature that you'll find at the bottom of your screen to ask your questions. So use chat to say hello and to visit with one another. But if you've got a question, then please use the Q&A feature to let Randy and I and our guest in on your questions, and we'll utilize those a little later on. Well, before I turn to Randy to set the stage today, it's our practice to take a minute of prayer to acknowledge God's presence in this digital space. We believe that God is present in all times and places, and as we gather here in community today, we want to invite him into that space and for us to be fully attentive to him. So let me invite you to a minute of silence now. Eternal presence, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, hear our prayers and be merciful to us today, we pray. Amen. Well, Randy, you and I are in a lot of conversations with ministers across the country. We were in a bunch just last week, and we're hearing a lot of stuff. What are you seeing and hearing as you talk to ministers across the country?
Well, I'm kind of reminded of the experience that probably a lot of us had when we were growing up with our fathers or mothers or coaches, and we were playing a sport and fell down and crying, and they say, okay, rub some dirt on it and get up and get going. And sometimes that's what you need to do. And we've said that to some ministers. Okay, you just need to develop a little thicker skin, and you got to push through. But if you got a broken arm, then rubbing dirt on it doesn't do you much good. And pandemics and other forms of crisis sometimes reveal a brokenness of soul that we have, and the right response to that is not okay, toughen up. It's to get some help. Pandemics reveal, and we're having a lot of things revealed to us about ourselves and our churches, and it is time we kind of take stock and see what that's doing to us. Our colleague David Ray is always talking about we're wounded healers. He kind of stealing that from somebody else, and if you're too wounded, it's pretty hard to do too much healing. So this is a timely conversation.
Yes, thanks, Randy. Henri Nouwen's wounded healer image, it seems never more appropriate than this time as we think about the pressures that are on ministers and other caregivers during this time. Well, I'm so excited that we've got Chelsie Sargent with us today as our guest to help us think about self-care in this time of pandemic. Chelsie is a licensed professional counselor. She's been in practice since 2007 in Houston, Texas. And she comes to this with a lot of expertise in depression, anxiety, anger, and other aspects of human struggle. And she's an expert in the Enneagram. She's been certified as an anger management expert and therapist. She's deep into a doctoral program and professional practice. And another dimension for Chelsie that I think is so important for us is she's a spouse of a minister, and a pretty darn good one too. This is a shout out to Steve here today for who's a very important part of Chelsea's life. But so professionally and personally, she's deeply aware of congregations, of churches, and ministers, and the burden, the particular burden and aspect of ministers' lives as they attend to the care of congregations and ministerial leadership and more. She's also a consulting partner with us in the Siburt Institute. So it's just a deep joy, Chelsie, to welcome you to be with us here today.
I'm so excited to join y'all, specifically talking about self-care and the minister. This is something I'm very passionate about and do a lot in my office. So I'm so excited to be in this conversation.
Yes, I know we, from time to time, send folks to talk to you, and I know the quality and good work that you do. Well, Chelsie, let's kind of lay out the lay of the land here. In the last 7-8 months with the pandemic, what's happening in terms of mental health in the United States? Set the table for us.
Yes. So as I'm sure many of you are aware, we have lots of things going on in our world, in our country. A pandemic, which many of us, if not all of us, have really never lived through something like this. Election year, we've had a lot of protests with the Black Lives Matter and social tensions, and I think people are pulled in all different directions, specifically starting with the pandemic that shut us all down in March. And one of the big things that happens within that is isolation started to happen. We were pulled out of our communities. And because it was something that none of us had experienced, there was no roadmap for it. And so the American Psychological Association has been putting out numbers. They were pretty diligent about putting out numbers pretty quickly after the pandemic hit of how it was affecting adults across the US. In their latest numbers, which came out in October, they said that 8 in 10 adults say that COVID is a significant source of stress for them. 60% of adults in America say that they feel overwhelmed on a daily basis. And 1 in 5 adults say their mental health is worse than it was this time last year. A lot of these numbers were just released last month. And so what we are also seeing in the middle of this health pandemic is a mental health pandemic that is closely following, that is affecting us now, and then that we are going to see repercussions from for a long time to come, even after this pandemic starts to be cleared up at some point.
But I suppose ministers are immune to all of this, right?
And then I have a special heart. I have a special heart for ministers because we're all dealing with our own personal effects of the pandemic. And then you have a whole congregation who is experiencing the pandemic in all sorts of different ways. And so you have your own personal piece that is being affected. And then you have members who are losing jobs, losing family members, older members who are in total isolation, teens who have had to pivot to online school, and how that affects the family system. And so it's the octopus, the head of the pandemic, and then it has tons of different reaches of how it affects everyone. So it's not just yourself.
Yeah. Well, and I guess when that stress begins to build up, then it starts to pop out in certain sorts of ways. And this is your expertise, but I'm thinking like depression, or how does it begin to manifest itself in the lives of folk? Um,
So one of the things to be aware of is the baseline for anxiety and depression. We all have that, and all of us at some point probably need to address kind of where our baseline of how depression feelings, anxiety feelings, and then with COVID, all of our baselines have elevated. And so everyone is feeling more anxiety, more depression. And there's there's some normalization to that of what we're feeling. But what we're getting concerned about, specifically in the mental health world, is this is now turning into chronic anxiety, chronic stress, chronic depression, which leads to effects on the body, the heart, hypertension, and then also leads over into chronic depression, chronic anxiety, chronic stress, which can go into clinical depression, clinical anxiety, and can start manifesting in other ways that way.
So we move from acute to chronic and then into clinical dimensions of all of this. Well, that raises several things in my head all at once, but one of the things that I think I wonder about ministers in this, well, before I even get to that, so that starts to impact not just me, but anybody that I'm connected to, right? So systems, families, elder groups, leadership teams. It has, back to your octopus arms, right? I mean, this is not just about one person, but systemically begins to impact.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I'm curious about is oftentimes when ministers find themselves dealing with, as the baseline moves up and we begin to have these feelings of anxiety or feeling depressed, one of the particular challenges, I suppose, just within the broad population is the rise of shame, or a sense that, well, it can't be me, or certainly I don't have an issue. But talk a little bit about this business of shame, and particularly with regard to ministers. I think we think, well, we're professionals, we're supposed to be able to rise above this and travel at the 30,000 foot level and not be impacted by the give and take of human experience and human life. But I can tell you that's a fallacy. But what's the deal about shame and all of that?
Yeah, so I mean, shame is a big thing that I talk about on a daily basis with people. I think there's a lot of shame around mental health, kind of what you were saying, and Randy was alluding to earlier, and using a very good Texas term is, I should be able to pull myself up by my bootstraps and move forward. And like you said, I'm a professional. I should be able to handle this, or my problems aren't as big as the people in my congregation. I have resources, I have my health, everything's going well for me. Why am I feeling this anxiety, this depression? And shame makes us want to hide out. And when we hide out, we don't talk to other people about our feelings or what's going on. And then it continues to get bottled up internally. And what we know, one of the best ways to bring shame out of the closet, to expose it, is to expose it to light, to expose it to conversation, to have conversations with other people. And a mental health therapist is a fantastic place to do that. Spiritual direction is another great place for ministers to find an outlet. Also, meeting with other ministers, having a group of people who are experiencing common things in their careers. One of the biggest blessings in my career is I have a clinical group that I meet with once a month, who all have clinical brains, who are all therapists, who all walk the same road that I do. And those conversations are life-giving. And so for ministers, what I have found is that they can create a small group of other people who know what they're going through, and they don't have to use a lot of words around that. For just someone to sit there and say, me too, there's a lot of power in that, and that squashes shame. And so the more you can talk about it, the less likely shame will hold you back from conversation.
How do you keep that from turning into everybody in the group dragging everybody in the group down? You were depressed when you went into the group and you're ready to jump off a bridge by the time you walk you walk out? How does that work?
Very good question. I think part of it works that you also have another outlet somewhere. And so one of the things with ministers meeting that I've noticed that works really well is meeting with people who you also have parts within the meeting that are uplifting, that it's not all doom and gloom. So I do this in my office a lot of talking about the things that are going well and that there is a balance, and being able to speak words of encouragement to one another. And so when one person is talking, being able to be real, authentic, share what's going on, and that the other people can not say, surface things back to them of it's going to be okay, or we're all experiencing this, but be able to speak words of truth into them too. So it's an ebb and flow and a balance of being able to speak real and be authentic, but also have people who are speaking truth and words and light into the conversation. I find that gratitude is a good time to practice with whatever you're going through. And whether that's in the group of ministers or that is with yourself personally, research shows that people who practice gratitude, writing it down every day, or having a place where they say it verbally, that can also help elevate mood.
We have noticed lots of ministers who are struggling at the moment, but whenever we've given them opportunities to say, okay, tell us what's working or what's going well or what you're learning, very quickly they start telling us things. It doesn't really matter who it is. This is the good things that have been happening in this time, and everybody's got something to complain about, but everybody's got something to be grateful for too, for sure.
Yeah, that makes me think of just the Ignatian practices of consolation and desolation. And Chelsie, I know you're aware of that, all right? When you began to describe that, Chelsie, it made me think of, for the first 20 years of my ministerial life in Indianapolis, Indiana, I was a part of a group of 6 ministers that met once a month. And we did that for 20 years, including at least two in-depth retreats a year at a Benedictine monastery. And that balance of both honest sharing, but also the practice of gratitude, and then just sharing a meal together, and to use colloquialism, just a jaw flap, and to be with one another in camaraderie was so life-giving. And it's one of the reasons why I think Randy and I feel so blessed to be able to lead a program called CMI at the Siburt Institute to create those kinds of spaces. One of the things I'm wondering about, I want to back up just a little and we run on out, but we're talking about this shame. We want to hide. We want to get into the darkness. We need to get the light exposed to this. But that movement, coupled with this sense of isolation that you began with, seems to be to just sort of hyperventilate this whole, it's like adding more fuel to the fire or a dangerous sort of situation. Am I drawing the connections there? Isn't this time a little even more troubling because of that?
Absolutely. I think that one of the cycles of this pandemic, one of the words that I use a lot in my office is it's relentless. I was just having a conversation with someone earlier this week that they thought that this was going to go on for a week or two, and then life was going to be able to go back to normal. And that's not at all. And then even if you look at the CDC's projections and different experts, a lot of them say that to get back to what we knew as normal is going to be months and months and months away. As we clear this pandemic out. So we're seeing this relentless, and there's cycles and there's new waves. We're dealing with a new wave of numbers rising all over the country right now. And so it's like we get used to something, and maybe you get your self-care of like, okay, I have this, and then you have to pivot again. And that is hard. That's hard for our bodies. That's hard for our minds. That's hard for our souls. And so a big word that I use a lot with people, we have to be really gentle with ourselves, really gentle with others. We're doing the best we can with what we have. And do we really believe that? And do we believe that of others? And I think if we can approach that with ourselves and with others, there's more of a sense of grace as we're all trying to navigate something that's unprecedented.
So, anybody who's not a little frustrated, down, struggling would be somebody who doesn't understand the situation. Okay, if you're paying attention, you're feeling the stress. But one of the things we were talking about in preparation, you have to make a distinction between what's situational, and I think I called it existential, and you're more likely to call it clinical. How do we tell what are the things that, okay, the situation is going to change at some point, I can kind of wait this out, and what are the things I need to address, because even when the situation changes, those things might not change in me. How do you make that distinction?
Yes, so I have a situational anxiety, and then I talk to people about clinical anxiety. And so situational is I'm in the middle of an experience of a season, and this is going to end at some point, or I am going to journey and evolve through this season. The pandemic can be look at that in for a certain sense. And then clinical is where it moves over into the word that I was using, chronic, hyper anxiety, hyper worry. It is disrupting my daily life. I cannot do the things that I need to do, the practices that I normally engage in, and mood is starting to shift. Other people are making comments that I'm not myself. I'm wanting to withdraw even more. Those are things to look for, is where you get more into the clinical anxiety, of where talk therapy or even medication, speaking to your doctor, those kinds of things are highly recommended. Whereas situational, I am still able to engage in my self-care. I have good support around me that I'm engaging in and talking to. And I feel like, even though I'm having to pivot and it's hard and it's changing, I'm still feeling like I am able to do the things that I need to do daily to take care of myself.
Well, let's take that and kind of play. You mentioned some things earlier, but I want to kind of go back through some of those and kind of tease them out a little bit. That might be ways of taking care of oneself. So you mentioned, for example, a spiritual director. What would that be like? How, in what way would that be helpful to have someone that we would call a spiritual director to orient life?
Yeah, so when we're talking about self-care, if you're taking notes, this is kind of what I want you to start jotting down, is how do I care for my mind? How do I care for my body? And how do I care for my soul? And I think a good place to start with spiritual direction is the soul, is someone who is listening to God on my behalf, someone who is going to ask me about my relationship with God and what spiritual disciplines that I'm engaging in, and asking me about the conversations that I'm having with God. I've met with a spiritual director for about the last 7 years. No, almost a decade, 10 years. And just sitting with someone asking me about those things, specifically my conversations with God, pulls me into soul care and how I'm tending to my soul and talking to God about my heart and what's going on. And I think that's really good accountability. And I know the two of you can probably speak a lot to the spiritual direction piece, as y'all are very familiar with that. But I think spiritual direction coupled with psychotherapy, counseling, is a very beautiful mix of taking care of the whole self.
Randy, let me just pivot real quick to you. What would be a leading question that a spiritual director might ask a minister? Just reflecting a little bit about Chelsea's narrative there. What might be an early question you might ask to sort of probe into a minister along those lines?
Well, I think in kind of these situations, there are so many different stressors that very quickly God can sort of disappear from the equation. So you're thinking about how do you handle things with your family, and how do you handle things with your church. And so sometimes, I ask, okay, how are you and God doing? And are you on speaking terms? Yeah. And when you pray, how do you pray? That's not a question about how often you pray. That's a question about what's your prayer life like when you're praying. And that's what spiritual direction does, is kind of brings God back into this equation. When do you feel the wind of God in your sails, and when do you feel a bit becalmed? And those are not substitutes for the therapeutic questions. They're something else entirely.
That's nicely said. Well, Chelsie, let's turn there a little bit. So Randy's using the term therapeutic here. There's a place too for seeing somebody who's a professional therapist, right? But I'll hasten to say, sometimes I think ministers may be a little nervous about that, right? So make the case. Why should a minister go see a therapist?
Absolutely.
I'm throwing you a
So
softball here.
I know this is one of my favorite questions. So I think one of you used the example of the broken arm. When you go to a doctor and you've broken your arm, there's some ease in being able to figure out what's wrong, right? Is the doctor's going to say, let's get an x-ray, let's see where the break is, and then we can put a cast on it. Mental health is different. It's not like you're going to walk into a doctor and you put your body under an x-ray and be able to say, okay, here's what's going on. And I used the word very specifically earlier, the phrase, the whole person. Is there's many different things that make me, mind, body, soul. And so going into a counselor and being able to be educated on what mental health is in general, what anxiety is, what depression is, being able to have a safe place with someone who has no stake in your life, just to be able to bounce ideas off of, to get education from, to be able to have maybe what you're saying reflected back to you in a different way. That's not your spouse, that's not your children, that's not a congregant, that's not your shepherd, your elder, your parent, someone who has a totally different objective and different way of looking at it. They're trained to be able to sit in that space with you, hold space with you, and reflect back what you are saying. One of my favorite things to say when people come into counseling is, it is not my job to save you. I think that what my job is you come and you sit on my couch and I join the work that God is already doing. And so God is already doing a work in you. And sometimes we get lost from that, or it's hard for us to see that. And so again, having a counselor, having a spiritual director, having a group of ministers to meet with can call you back to that path and that journey, and remind you that God's doing a work in you. And I think it's normal to sometimes get into dark places, places where it's hard to see the path forward. And just like if I were to go into a doctor with my arm broken, and he's like, this is the cast that we need to put on this arm, I would say yes. And so if I'm saying struggling with anxiety or depression, why wouldn't I go to a counselor and say something's not working? Help me understand it differently.
That's nicely said. Nicely said. It occurs to me as we're talking about spiritual director, we're talking about a therapist, we've been talking about having peers, a group of other ministers, for example, that you have a relationship with. There's in some ways having a really good trusted friend, right? There's sort of a set of degrees, or a circle of relationships, both professional as well as those that are a little more informal, that make up sort of a web of relationships to maintain health and spiritual vitality. Is that fair to say, Chelsie?
Absolutely. It's not one-dimensional. And so I think, again, that's also kind of the toughness of it, but also the goodness that can come from it is having a couple different places where you're going to get that. So pre-pandemic, one of the things that I try to do in my monthly and weekly life is have coffees in the mornings before I started my work with friends, make sure that I'm putting that somewhere in my calendar. And that was me being proactive. Out of a place of I'm going to have to put that on there, or my schedule is going to take over. And I think it's very much the same for ministers. If I don't put the counselor on my calendar, the time with my spiritual director, the time meeting with ministers, the time grabbing coffee with a friend, it's not just going to jump on there organically.
Right. Hey, let's take one more quick minute. Oh, Randy, you got a thought there?
Oh, no, I've just been following the questions. There's a lot of interesting ones, and I'm hoping we can,
Get to them.
yeah, get to them pretty quick. Some of them I think can be answered briefly. Others going to require more.
Well, why don't you queue one up? While you're doing that, let me just ask for a quick response here from Chelsie about, you mentioned soul, mind, but then body. Just say a quick word about physical activity here, and then Randy, you're up.
So I call these my three organics. All my clients hear this from me on the first session is exercise, sleep, and eating. Are you moving your body every single day? That is one of the best forms to organically fight depression and anxiety, because that releases our feel-good chemicals in our brain, which actually gives us energy and helps us, our moods feel better. It is really unrealistic to think that we're going to get good things from our bodies and brains if we do not feed it good things. And so, I mean, I'm not the biggest health person, but I can say eating 3 balanced meals a day, healthy snacks between, not depriving myself of calories, not overeating because I'm anxious. So just mindfully understand what I'm putting in my body, because I need that energy to be able to show up wholly myself. And then sleep. If you're having sleep problems, that's a fantastic time to reach out to a counselor and have a conversation with your doctor. If you are not resting your brain, again, you are not going to be able to function at the level that you probably want to on a day in, day out basis, taking care of yourself and taking care of others.
That's good. Randy, bring up a question for us here.
I was thinking, I've got a former student who's a doctor, and he said, we've discovered this miracle drug that helps almost anything. I said, what is it? And he says, exercise. And it turns out that exercise is the closest thing to a miracle drug that there is. And I'm like, well, great. I'd rather take a pill. There are several questions around the idea. One of the special things about being a minister is you not only have to bear your anxieties, you have to bear your anxieties of your leadership in the church at the same time. And with regard to things like a pandemic, you can't get it right. For some people, it's unsafe at any speed, and for other people, you're not moving fast enough, and the minister is going to wind up being the one who receives all those complaints from both sides. And you're also trying to move your staff and your leadership to places of spiritual health. How do you want to speak into that, where you're getting lots of pressure from your congregation and your elders, and it's coming from a lot of different directions, and it doesn't seem like win-win. It seems like lose. How do you handle that?
Okay, so the bad news that I can share first is I don't think that's going to let up. And because we've talked about that we're having to pivot so much, is I don't think there's going to be any easy answers to that piece. The good news to that, and this is one of my favorite examples to get, is I remember when I was a new mom, I would get on an airplane and the flight attendant would come by before we took off, and he would always say to me, make sure you put your oxygen mask on before you put your daughter's oxygen mask. And I remember when she was really little being like, oh, well, I would take care of her first, right? And so she would have oxygen flowing to her. And what I learned and what I thought about and what I know in my practice as a counselor is if I have no oxygen flowing to me, I'm going to be of no use to anyone around me. And so again, I think that's why even though there's no easy answers to that piece, and the anxiety and pressure is going to build up in that sense, that your self-care and your prioritizing that oxygen to you first is going to be able to let you withstand that anxiety, that pressure, the continued pivoting a little bit differently. Again, I can't say that it's going to make everything totally normal and manageable, but you doing your self-care, understanding that piece, understanding how self-care affects you and what is best for you to engage in will make some of those things not as overwhelming.
A related question is it ever all right to say, I'm out of gas right now? And you know, do you get to tell your church or your leadership, like, I need to take a step. I need to take a step backwards, because that's sort of contrary to everything in us, and it's scary for us to do that. I mean, all the ways that can turn out are bad. We could step back and nobody notices, and that's bad. Or we could step back and bad things happen, and that's bad. So, you ever get to say, okay, I'm out of gas today?
I think you do. And I think you use the correct language around that. I think that's extremely scary for ministers to do. I think some of the most intimate, beautiful conversations that I've had around that is when they do come to that place and realize either I'm going to continue to push forward and it is going to be at the detriment of myself and I will crash and burn at some point, versus can I advocate and ask to be able to step back so I can regroup, have a sabbatical, be able to come back into self, get that oxygen mask on for an extended period of time so I can come back and engage and continue to be a part of this community. But again, I've heard stories on all sides of how that have turned out for ministers. And so I'm not going to pretend like that's not a hard or scary place to be in. But just to answer your question from the beginning of that, is I absolutely think that is okay and needed to say at times.
We've had some ministers quitting, getting out of ministry. And, as I have those conversations with ministers at the moment, my gut reaction, and I'm placing myself for you to say, okay, you got this wrong. You need to do this a different way. My gut reaction is to generally say, don't decide that now. Mm-hmm. This is the wrong time to make that decision. But I don't know. There's certainly sometimes where people, for their own health, need to step away. What do you think about making long-term decisions in the midst of a pandemic?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think what maybe some ministers are feeling when they come to that point of wanting to quit is, how burned out were you before the pandemic? What was your self-care like before the pandemic? And then you put a massive stress on top of that, and everything is going to feel 10 times heavier. When anyone comes in, corporate or ministry or nonprofit, and they are burned out and have nothing left to give, I definitely have a list of things that we go through before we come to quitting. And a lot of that is advocating with your board, with your elders, with your managers. Can you take a step back? Are there things that you can do alongside coming into therapy on a regular basis, so we can work on fleshing out, do you need to quit? Is this burnout? Are there tools that you can implement to feel better and engage in this work? Or is it time to go in a different direction? But that is going to take time and conversation to be able to figure out. And usually when you reach burnout, and I have personally reached burnout in my career about 7 years ago, laying on the floor sobbing, saying, I can't do this anymore. And I remember someone kind of coming up to me and kind of rubbing my back while I was laying there on the floor. And she's like, maybe you should talk to someone. And I saw a therapist for a while who saw counselors, and that was life-changing. And so sometimes we know the answers, or we tell people what the answers are, and then we don't do them ourselves. And so I think being able to know, like, when is it time to quit and move in a different direction for my own health? What is burnout? And how can I advocate for myself in those things?
Let's picking up on a question here that kind of tags onto this. How might you go to a board or to your elders or to your managers? How would you begin to stake a claim or stake the case that, I'm drowning here and I need some space, or I need to back off, or I need some help? Any thoughts there?
Yeah. So one of the things that I would encourage in that is to be seeing a counselor before you do that. Maybe having conversations with your spiritual director before you do that, or a minister who's a little bit further down the road, because they can also help you kind of map out what you would like to say, and also that you have support. Again, I've sat in all different places with people, and some people have gotten great support from their elders and shepherds on that, and some people have not. And that's been a very painful experience. And so I think already seeing a counselor or having that proactive care built in can also help you be able to work through what you want to say and how you want to say it. So you're not, again, like I was saying earlier, doing everything by yourself and bottling everything up. Some people will go in to their elders and it's the first time they've processed it out loud. So maybe having a place that you've processed it a little bit already, so you know best how to advocate for yourself and what your boundaries are going to be.
That's good.
Well, yeah, and I think even if the minister is not in a situation where he needs a therapeutic help, he or she probably needs somebody outside the system, because those leaders have this kind of double responsibility. And I used to kind of despair how poorly elderships pastored their ministers, but it's become clearer to me that's not very easy to do. There probably needs to be somebody pastoring the minister besides just the elders in the system. And that's one of the great things about technology is you can now find that person,
Yes.
even if you're a little bit isolated. One of the things the pandemic has done is forced families together. And is that good news or bad news? Well, yes, because whatever pathology is there is certainly going to get exacerbated, right? What do you do if your family situation is tense, or is taking all of your energy, because we're all part of systems, right? Of which family is the most intimate?
I think that's a good question. That's what we were talking about, the octopus having many arms. And I think that's one of them. You bring up a good thought on that. Is it's not just you being stressed and then trying to pastor your congregation. It's also that you walk into a family, a home each night that has all sorts of individuals that are making up that house. And so I think that's why it's a good thing to go back and remember that everyone is processing through it in different ways. That's why I was throwing out some of the numbers from the APA of how it's affecting adults, teenagers, the elderly. So each age group brings its unique pieces into that, and each age group is going to make up the family. I think that's also something else, again, going back to your own self-care and realizing that your family is going to be handling this, and the pathologies that were already there are going to be exacerbated during that. And so again, having outside sources that your family's talking to as well. So how often are they talking to friends? How often does your spouse need a spiritual director? Can y'all have those kind of conversations? Is it time to get marital support and just have someone else who's giving you ideas and support through that? So again, it may not just be one piece of getting support for yourself. It may also be looking at the system and saying, is there more support that we need to help open up conversations in a different way?
Let's our lives are really, really full. We're really stretched all very, very, very thin. How do we create a little space on our already too full plates for some of the things that we're talking about? Talk about that hard work, Chelsie.
Yeah, so we were talking about it being, so we have the body, which we talked about that, and then we had the soul, the spiritual piece of it, and then you have the mind. And we don't have much fringe time, much kind of the margin time. That's something you have to be really mindful of. And again, that I think people have to pencil in. So I always tell people, how much of your brain space is being taken up by social media? How much of your brain space is being taken up by the news? How much of your brain space is being taken up? And you can fill in the blank with that.
You're starting to preach on metal.
And if you take out some of those things, there will be space. And I think that our mental space and our mental energies, I know that I'm not, I have to really fight for that. But I think a lot of us are very unaware of how much that is siphoned off by other things. And so one of my personal practices, and a practice I'm working a lot on in my office, is clearing up some of that mental space and having boundaries around social media, around my news intake, so I can lean into that margin space and let my mind rest. Let my mind be on something that's not causing anxiety, that's not causing that elevated sense of anxiousness and worry. I think that's a good place maybe to begin, to see how much space opens up for you.
That's good.
You know,
What
Richard Foster used to sort of have this deal where he talked about anything you find you can't do without is probably something you need to get rid of. And we've become overly dependent on some things, and the people behind those things do not have our good health in mind. There's people spending a lot of time about thinking about how to occupy your mind and space. That I had a student years ago who has an experiment. It was a guy in my class. He gave up video games for a while, and he found he had to take up new hobbies because he had so much time available. He had never had any time available. He had trouble getting his homework done and all that sort of thing. So here's this guy, he has to take up knitting, because he's got so much space. And I'm just wondering if it might not be a bad exercise to sort of keep a log for a while and find out how much time it's taking up. And that doesn't measure how much headspace it is, because you watch a 30-minute news thing, and it may occupy your mind for hours and hours and hours beyond. But we probably should pay attention to what's taking up the space. Some of our congregations mistrust psychology.
Absolutely.
And that's and I want to make a distinction between spiritual direction, spiritual formation, and therapeutic clinical approaches. I think there's a difference. Certainly room for both. I think some people in therapy just need competent spiritual direction, and I think some people in our churches desperately need some therapy who aren't in it. How do you kind of talk about that in ways that help people see those are both legitimate worlds?
Absolutely. That's such a good question, and one that I could use a whole nother hour talking about. I think one of the biggest, healthiest things that you can do for your church is help address the stigma up front. And one of the best ways that you can do that is bring someone like me into the church and to speak to your people. And so I encourage ministers all the time to make relationships with other therapists in your vicinity. And so I have ministers from all denominations here in Houston who use me to refer to bring in to speak to their people, to talk to their boards, their elders, because if you put a real person in front of them that has the knowledge, it helps take away some of that stigma or some of that fear. Someone with good, sound knowledge of psychology and mental health and being able to talk about it in a really accessible way to your people can help break down some of those barriers, because a lot of people do come in hurt from counseling experiences, from the stigma around mental health and psychology. And so if you have someone come in that knows your community, that you trust, then maybe some of those can be taken down by just having a person talk about it. So it's not just something that's outside, it's also now inside. Also, it's good for me to have relationships with churches, because I can also refer to churches when someone's looking for a church, when someone's wanting to have conversations with a minister. And so it goes back and forth. And I think that distinction between spiritual direction and psychology, even though the whole person and a lot of it is intertwined, of knowing when someone needs to talk to a minister versus needing to talk to a therapist. But that's a relationship that's developed, and you go both ways of conversation on that.
I know we're coming to the end, but there is a question that came in that very nicely pointed out. We're having a pretty first world conversation here. Lots of resources, elders and deacons, and boy, there are a lot of places in the world where man or woman's out there sort of by themselves and aren't resource rich and may not be in a culture that's particularly disposed towards therapeutic approaches. What do you say to missionaries and not just missionaries, but people who are in different cultures? Because this sounds like a pretty Western church conversation that we're having.
Absolutely. That is, I thought about that in some of my preparation for this. Again, resources can be other things than just going to professionals or being able to have those people to reach out to. I know at our church, one of the things that we have and that we give out to people when they ask is a whole list of all sorts of resources in Houston for all sorts of things that come up in life, all the way from free resources to resources that you're going to pay for. And so again, being able to research within your community of if you have those resources and how you can tap into those specifically for lower income or low resourced individuals. I think that is a really important thing to be able to have at your fingertips. For people who cannot get a hold of resources, missionaries, people who have a hard time making those connections. One of the neat things about this time period with technology is being able to connect to people all over the world. And so maybe you don't have someone right in your vicinity to meet with or that you can reach out to, but I wonder if you reached out to the Siburt Institute, if they would be able to help you set up Zoom meetings with someone that you can connect with and have conversation with. I also wonder about books to read or things that you can engage in that way that can maybe give you a little bit of life when it feels like there's not a lot of resources out there for you to be able to engage in. Those are really hard conversations, and I'm really glad that comment came in, because that's a very good thing to be aware of, and that not all people are going to be in that situation in place.
But of course, some of the things we've talked about, prayer, exercise, sleep, you can do that anywhere.
Yeah. Right. Hey, Chelsie, we do need to start wrapping up here today, but you've mentioned a lot of things, but I expect you said something about resources a moment ago. Would you have some things you'd want to name for our viewers today that might be worth reading or exploring or viewing? What would you suggest?
Yeah, so I looked over all my resources and things that I thought would be good for y'all to be able to look into. This may offer a bit of wisdom. The first one, if you have not read The Inner Voice of Love by Henry Nouwen, I cannot recommend that book enough. It is his personal journal of his time in a mental health hospital. And it was not meant to be published. It was his own personal journals. And after years, different mentors really encouraged him to publish those. And I have it on audio and I listen to that often. It's a very, very beautiful words about being in dark space, specifically in the mental health sense. Cheryl Paul wrote a book called The Wisdom of Anxiety. It's a book that I use often in my office. It's very accessible. It gives you tangible things to work on with anxiety. So written for the lay person to be able to take in. It's fantastic. Kate Bowler is a fantastic author and podcaster. And her book, Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved. She's a person who lives with cancer, and I really think her perspective on what it means to be in a hard and dark place and still have hope is, her words are beautiful in that sense. And then the last one, this one kind of debated on whether or not to put this on here, but I think it's good, is Jesus Calling by Sarah Young. I really like her devotional. They're very short. You can take them in 2 or 3 minutes at the beginning of the day, and she addresses anxiety in there probably more than anything else throughout all of her devotionals. So it's a good one for the soul, that if you don't have much time, maybe just doing that at the beginning of your day, while also maybe kind of writing down what's taking up space in your brain, like Randy was saying, could just be the beginning of maybe some sort of really good self-care practice.
That's great. That's great. Well, we're not able to get to every question today. If there's something that's really pressing on one of you as a viewer, don't hesitate to write in and we'll try to respond in some way. We'll try to be faithful to that. Randy, let's wrap up. Let me ask you if any last word you have to offer to our conversation today, and then I'll turn Chelsie to you.
Yeah, I was looking through our list of attendees. I know there's at least 2 or 3 other therapists who are on here today. And so I guess my last word is just an absolute begging plea. If you're going under, don't just let it happen. It may turn out in the end you do go under, but at least let somebody try to help. And I tell that to all my young minister friends. If you feel like you're going under, do something. Let's try together. And there's no shame in that. I've seen a therapist in the past. It was really helpful. And I've always had spiritual mentors in my life. And so don't just give in to despair. Let's try together. That's what it. And I'm begging. I'm pleading with you. Don't just give in to it.
You're here. Well said, Randy. Chelsie, what would you offer as we wrap up here today?
I'll leave you with another story. A lot of times with anxiety and depression, you feel like you are going underwater and you just can't quite get your head above water. And reaching out for help, like Randy was talking about, it means that someone's out there on a lifeboat and they can start throwing you preservers for you to start hooking your arms over. And so maybe that's starting out with a friend. And if you can't get your head above water after you hooked that ring, then maybe it's talking to other ministers. And if you can't get your head above water, maybe it's talking to a spiritual director. And if you can't get your head above water, then maybe it's time to come down the mental health path. And it's just a matter of, at some point, you're going to come above water. But it's you advocating for yourself, you saying, I'm not okay, and then stepping into safe places where people can minister to you. I have a huge heart for ministers, and what you are doing is important. And so putting that oxygen mask on first so you can continue to go out and do God's work, we need that. So love yourself and those around you by engaging in those things. So I'm so grateful all of y'all joined this conversation and allowed me to come into this space. So much gratitude.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Chelsie. What a wonderful hour of conversation this has been. Thanks for joining Randy and I today for this. And we'll have to have you back. We'll have to talk about psychology or something, right? We'll find something. To our participants, viewers, thank you for joining us this hour today. And write to us, let us know what you're thinking, and give us some feedback about the program today, or other things that you'd like to see us bring onto the program as we move toward 2021. I want to say thank you to our Siburt Institute staff who've been a part of this. Renee Paul, who heads up the logistics for this program. Ola May and Leah, I know, have been a part of this. Carissa's been involved today with this. I want to let everyone know that our last intersection for 2020, wow, wouldn't it be nice to bring this year to a close, will be intersection number 8, and it'll be on December the 8th. December 8th, we're going to be hosting John Mark Hicks, Mark Powell, and Greg McKenzie, who've recently authored a book called Discipleship and Community, published by ACU Press. We're going to bring them in and have a conversation about their book and how that might be playing itself out as congregations think about this time of transition and upheaval and change. It'll be a great and exciting conversation with those authors and ministers and scholars. So look for that December the 8th. We'll be posting news about that. So I would just say to you as we close, remember that God is present and that help is around. Don't lay in the water. Raise an arm. Speak out. Let somebody know. Randy, let's close here. Would you offer a final word of benediction for us?
The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and give you peace. To him who is able to keep you from falling and to present you before his glorious presence without fault and with great joy. To the only God, our Savior, be glory and majesty, dominion and power through Jesus Christ our Lord, before all ages, now and forevermore, world without end. Amen.
Amen. Blessings to you all.